Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network for a final segment of today's show. And it's a little fun one as always to conclude these early shows here in the week. My fantasy fact versus fiction segment yesterday, I did my Don't Be Surprised If segment where I make several bold fantasy claims to kind of monitor throughout the weekend in fantasy football. Now I'm going to make some more claims and either justify or debunk them for you, because I feel a lot of interesting matchups are taking place as we get later and later into the season. A lot of interesting storylines about certain players. Will they or won't they in certain situations? Which teams really stand out? Which matchups really pop on paper, potentially from a fantasy standpoint? So I really love adding this segment to the show because it just makes you think a little bit more about certain decisions you want to make down the stretch for your fantasy squad, no matter where you are on the table. And so that's why I feel like I have this segment, have to have some fun with it, and as always, it's a pleasure to conclude the Tuesday shows. Without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with a guy who I'm all too familiar with. I love talking about this guy. Starting to become a true potential wide receiver one for the Seattle offense. He's outpacing DK Metcalf, clearly usurped Tyler Lockett as at least the wide receiver 2, and potentially Gino's favorite read down the field, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And I think that a big storyline to follow here is how high can this kid go? How high is his ceiling for the rest of the season? Can he usurp even DK Metcalf as the number one option there in Seattle? And the thing that I came up with was, can he continue this fantasy hot streak even? Because a lot of people invested a lot into him, truly thinking of him as a potential breakout star in this campaign. At the start of the season, it didn't look that way, but now he truly is. And the take that I come up with is JSN continuing this fantasy hot streak, but however, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, I'm coming to you and saying, at least for this weekend, no. I think this is going to be fiction here. And the reason why I think this is, at least for this weekend at the very least, is because when you look at these NFC West matchups, very little separates this team. When you look at other divisional rivalries around the league, you're starting to see a vast separation, right? Some of them are still feisty. Some of them are still important. I'm not saying or indicting any one division or one divisional matchup here. But in the NFC West, it's going to start to get a lot tighter just because of the logjam in this division. And when I look at this matchup, especially between the Seahawks and Cardinals, second time in 3 weeks, and what Seattle's travel has looked like, and the way they had to go over to New York, have that emotional game, fly back to Arizona, it's going to mess with them a little bit. I don't necessarily think it will take them out of this game entirely. I think it's still going to be a close game, but it's not going to be offense-driven, much like that last game was. So that's why I feel like JSN, at least in this matchup, is not going to stand out. Maybe he will, and maybe I'll look silly because someone's going to have to be the difference in this matchup here, but I do think that in this game, now the Cardinals know potentially the pass plays that Gino and JSN are comfortable playing with. I think that his stats are going to diminish, at least for this week alone. Potentially, this could change the fact after this game, down the stretch, when they're playing tougher games. But for now, I'm going to say fiction for this week in terms of the JSN hot streak continuing. Then, the next one, this one is kind of a silly one, but I always like to throw at least one long shot out there. Aaron Rodgers potentially being a fantasy sleeper against the Dolphins. Should he start? Because it kind of is up in the air about his status to start. I think Ulbrich is confident in him at the time, right now, the time being, but it could change throughout the week because I'm truly not sure what Aaron Rodgers really is in this offense. As Tap to Learn said, Rams will get it done. Experience, coach, and roster will prevail. I believe he's actually talking about the NFC West title rather than, just any one game in the division. I completely disagree. The Seahawks have all the momentum. They may not have the easiest schedule, but that defense can match up against any offense and completely shut them down. They did it for 3 weeks running, and This is not a biased opinion. I'm seeing with my own eyes. After the hectic nature of that first half where they could have been taken out of the game, that defense locked down that Jets offense from the 7:39 mark of the second quarter to the end of the game. And I don't necessarily think, the Rams right now are in a position where I feel like down the stretch, they're going to differentiate themselves from people. They've been pretty middling throughout the season. Yes, they have the important tiebreakers in the division should it come down to that. But I do think the Rams, the problem is I can't really see any consistency in this team. They have a tough matchup against the defense. As Tap to Learn says, McDonald is shaky. I'm not necessarily certain. Oh, Mike McDonald. Well, here's the thing I'll say about Mike McDonald. He might not be the best coach, but he's changed the culture a lot there in Seattle. He's really keeping the squad accountable, and I really think that that's mattered a lot in the development of the squad from where they were to start the season. And not now. As Tap to Learn always says, Cards D may make some noise. Well, if the Seahawks defense will make some noise, it doesn't matter. Because I think the Seahawks offense, as bad as some areas of it are, and some aspects of it are, I think it's opportunistic enough to put up enough points to where the defense can shut down a team. And even when they're losing and their offense isn't necessarily clicking, the defense can do enough to be able to keep them in that game. And that's why Seattle is such an interesting team in terms of their contender status in the division, potentially in the playoffs, because of the fact they're a very opportunistic squad. They're not necessarily good in one area, but they're not too bad or awful in one area. Potentially their offensive line will come back to bite them, but they're not necessarily that awful in any one area either. So that's why I think they stand out in this division as someone who's managed to find consistency in certain games. As he also acknowledges, only one team coming out of the West, no wildcards emerging. That I completely agree with you. It's going to come down to who wins this division, and it's going to be the team that can remain consistent. So far it's been Seattle. That could change, and I appreciate you mentioning other teams' strengths. But I do think that for time being, until Seattle proves otherwise, they right now are the best team in the NFC West at this current moment in time. Getting back to Aaron Rodgers here, yeah, I don't necessarily think this one's coming true, and I did say it was fact, but here's the reason why it could potentially still have merit. This Dolphins team could get caught up in itself a little bit after that demoralizing loss to Green Bay that kind of could have kept them in the playoff picture had they won, but still, it would have been a tough sledding situation for them down the stretch. But I do feel like, they're just small details away in that Jets offense from finding some modicum of consistency. In that game, it's not like, the receivers were frustrating Rodgers. Rodgers was more frustrating himself. If he can get a little bit of consistency, if he can rely on that run game most importantly, because that can really help him settle down, then potentially we'll start to see him click a little bit more with his receivers, get on the same page as them. Because that's been the problem. Rodgers has been getting in his own way, getting in his own head, because age is catching up to him. But now it's going to come down to just trying to get that out of his mind. Trying to focus on the team and try and focus on this connectivity to it as well. So that's why Aaron Rodgers, I still have some hope that at least for one game, he could potentially be a fantasy star for you. But I think a lot of people have given up on him anyways, and I wouldn't be mad if this doesn't come true, because it shouldn't, because of how bad he's been. But for now, I'm just trying to justify it a little bit so that I don't look too bad here. But I still think in this matchup, anything can happen in that division. Now, the third one I want to talk about is kind of a surprise, but I can see this one actually potentially proving me wrong. Bryce Young and Jalen Hurts being the top QBs of the week. I say this is fiction, but the reason why, it's not too far-fetched that this could happen is because I truly believe this QB matchup is more even than we think. Bryce Young has played his behind off ever since being benched and coming back after that Andy Dalton situation. Whereas Jalen Hurts, he's been fantastic, but I still believe that what brings him kind of to Not necessarily fully to Bryce's level, because I do think Jalen Hurts is a better quarterback, but his passing prowess is not necessarily improved as much as I would have liked to see it this season. That's what makes this a little bit more of an interesting situation. As Tableau says, back to the West. Cards' schedule very favorable. Seahawks have to run the gauntlet. Cards, Vikes, Pack, Rams. Let's be clear here. The Seahawks may only have to win 1 or 2 of those games, and it may have to just be those division games. They can lose to all 3 of the Vikings, Packers, and the Bears, and it wouldn't matter, because if you win in your division, chances are the other teams won't win with you. You'd have every single tiebreaker if you just beat the Cards and the Rams. Yes, you're going to have to see how the Cardinals' schedule breaks out, but if Seattle takes care of business in the division, I think they can win this division with just 8 or 9 wins. That's how weird this division truly is. And so that's why I feel like I can't really buy into the teams behind Seattle yet, because they haven't proven they can separate as Seattle has. And especially in the division, because Seattle now has wins over the 49ers and Cardinals, could have 2 wins over the Cardinals in that tiebreaker. And that matters, because it's much better to be 8-5 and with 2 important divisional wins, with 1 potentially to clinch the division in the final week of the season, than to have a losing record at that point and have a negative tiebreaker against you when you're going up head-to-head against Seattle at the end of the season. And while he's saying the Cards have the Pats and Panthers and 49ers, what's to say the Cardinals can't slip up? Because I really don't know what to make of that team. So that's the reason being. The final one I want to do is Kirk Cousins proving that he's a bust in terms of his former team here. And that's a fact here. I don't necessarily think Kirk Cousins has any hope in this matchup if he does start even for the Falcons against his former team. That Vikings team, yes, they don't generate takeaways as much, but they are a very aggressive defense. They're going to be generating a heck of a lot of pressure on a still pretty hobbled and quote-unquote sedentary Kirk Cousins here, if you know what I mean. And so that's why I feel like that's going to happen. But let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. Thank you for the NFC West talk. I still think Seattle could win this division. But other than that, this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. You know what to do in terms of subscribing to the show, liking, following it, and using these different features here on YouTube to really contribute to interact with the show. But other than that, I am out for today.